We're going to have this afternoon and discussion and debate. First, I want to thank Dimitri Symes, the head of the center, for inviting me and also holding this. Looking forward not only to hearing from our two distinguished speakers, but also hearing from all of you. So we're going to make this very interactive, and also, if I could use the word, we're going to make it challenging too, so that we all get our points in. We're going to hear first from Paul Saunders, who's, I'm sure, known to most, if not all of you here in the room. He is the executive director here of the center, and he's also the associate publisher of the National Interest. And he's going to be taking the side, and I'm going to pose the question, because we're looking at the question of, can the United States pursue a cooperation with authoritarian states without compromising its values? And you're going to be taking the side of answering that question, yes. I will let you really embellish, but I'm giving more of a categorical answer up front. Mark Lagon, who also I think is known to most of you in the room, his current position is he's Chief Policy Officer for the Friends of the Global Fight Against HIV, AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria. He also has been president of Freedom House and also served at the State Department as ambassador of the Anti-Trafficking in Persons Office, as well as being a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations. And we'll be hearing from him, and I think your answer is no, but I'm going to let you also present your views. So we're going to hear from them about 10 minutes and tackling that question. And so again, what we're looking at is, can the United States pursue cooperation with authoritarian states without compromising our values? Paul, let's go to you.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I hope everyone will be very forgiving with me. I'm a last-minute substitution for Ambassador Khalilzad, who I'm sure all of you noted on the invitation. He's leaving the country later today and had a change in his schedule that was really unavoidable and prevented him from being with us. So well, he was called to a meeting at the National Security Council, and I'm not sure I should say more than that. But in any event, he was unable to be with us, so I'm going to...
By the way, thank you for that qualification. I came and I knew there was a change, but I'm glad that you, since you were the recipients of his views directly, that you're sharing that with everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. That being said, let me try to outline a few points that came to me this morning in the couple of hours I had to think about this question. And I've got really, I would say, 5 reasons that I think we don't have much choice in dealing with these kinds of governments, and then 4 considerations for how we go about it. So first, the 5 reasons. I would say quite simply, number 1, we can't do everything ourselves. We need cooperation from other governments in dealing with some pretty tough issues. And if you survey some of the issues that the United States has to deal with, I think it becomes obvious fairly quickly why we need to work with some of these governments. Rise of China. We want to be able to work with countries like the Philippines, with countries like Vietnam. Those are authoritarian governments. North Korean nuclear program. We want to be able to work with the Chinese. Iran, Syria, ISIS, broader problem of terrorism. It's difficult to deal with those problems without talking to Saudi Arabia, without talking to Egypt, without working with Turkey, which is increasingly going in a more authoritarian direction, and actually without talking to Russia. Finally, and this is obviously just a few issues, not everything, but nuclear non-proliferation around the world, keeping nuclear weapons out of the hands of people who we don't want to have them. Russia, China, a number of others. Second reason, we've really got limited leverage in dealing with these governments in trying to compel them to accept our values. For many, if not most, if not all authoritarian governments, their highest priority is to stay in power. And to the extent that we try to force them to do things that they believe might compromise their ability to remain in power, they're likely either to refuse or alternatively to pretend to comply without actually complying. Either way, we don't achieve much if our objective is to try to compel them to change their behavior. Unless, actually, we're prepared to try to threaten the survival of one of those regimes in a different way that they find actually more threatening than what we're asking them to do. Third reason. In making foreign policy, the United States inevitably applies its principles, values, standards, whatever you want to call them, differently in different cases. We apply one set of standards to our friends, to our allies, to our partners. We apply a different set of standards to our competitors, to our rivals, to our adversaries. That's a natural and probably unavoidable element of making policy. But to the extent that we take strong stands on our principles while we simultaneously compromise our principles in certain cases, we really open ourselves up to charges of hypocrisy and undermine our ability to achieve our objectives in that area. Fourthly, whenever we define an area of disagreement with another government as a matter of principle rather than a matter of interest, it's inherently much more difficult for either side to compromise. It's much harder to compromise on your principles politically than it is to compromise on interests, because interests are much more fluid in many respects. And finally, fifth, I think we have a tendency, because of the nature of our political system, to focus very much on the immediate at the expense of the long term. And if we focus on the immediate in taking strong moral stands against dealing with a particular government, we may actually, in the long run, significantly compromise our ability to get a moral long-term outcome. And I think the first, and from my point of view, most glaring example I would point to in that case actually is the civil war in Syria. And if we had some kind of a negotiated solution with President Assad in 2011 or 2012 that kept him in power for 2 or 3 years, he would already be in the rear view mirror. And we may have avoided many of the problems that we had to experience and that the Syrian people very tragically had to experience over the last 6 years. So those are my 5 points. Then, for considerations in thinking about how to deal with these governments. First one, I don't think we can or should pretend that our values don't matter or that we're not troubled by various forms of their conduct. You know, it's a reality that Americans and their political representatives are disturbed by the conduct that many authoritarian regimes engage in domestically. And it's a reality that concern constrains the American relationship with those governments. And those governments should understand that to the extent that there are things that they want from the United States, their own behavior imposes limitations on what the American government can deliver. Secondly, I would say don't disregard the opposition inside these countries. In some cases, they may deserve our support. In most cases, they can be very important and useful sources of information, and if we ignore their perspective and ignore the information that they might otherwise provide us, we could be missing out on important political developments inside those countries that over time could compromise our interests and potentially our values too. Thirdly, and this goes a little bit in the opposite direction, just because someone represents opposition to an authoritarian government, I wouldn't necessarily take for granted their support for American interests or values. I would put Ahmed Chalabi actually as perhaps the poster boy for that point. And I think we've got to be pretty realistic and pretty careful in dealing with opposition leaders and opposition groups. That they often have a variety of motives, and to the extent that they're assembling coalitions, which is often the case in those circumstances, the coalitions have a diverse array of members with competing interests and objectives and principles and et cetera, et cetera. Finally, I would say I think we do also need to think very carefully about our message and our tone in dealing with these governments. And public pressure, I think more likely than not, provokes public resistance. It's much more effective to deal with our differences, to my mind, in the area of values and principles privately rather than publicly. And I guess I would say finally, to the extent that we can focus our messaging on results rather than on moralistic criticism or, again, these arguments about principles that lock governments into resisting what we're trying to achieve, I think we'll be much more successful. So I will end on that note.
Okay, good. I'm going to ask you one question before we go to Mark, just one, and you're both going to get the same question just at this moment. Give all of us your best example of where this has worked. All right, you've made the case, so where we have collaborated and we haven't compromised our values. Give what you think is the best example of it.
You know, I think the key question is the timeline. But certainly if you look in Asia, you know, we have a number of strong partners that didn't start as democracies and have evolved into democracies. It's been a long process, and there have been a lot of rough patches, I guess I would say, along the way. But if you look at a government like a South Korea or like a Taiwan, you know, those are governments that we engaged with, and over time, they moved in direction, that they are in today as solid American allies and partners.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Paul. Mark.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you to Dimitri for hosting a freewheeling conversation like this. In many ways, I may be in a disadvantaged position because any reasonable person must think that the United States, as a leading power or the leading power in the world, must work with all major powers or some smaller ones to deal with problems like Paul judiciously talks about. What I want to do is flip this question on its head, not look at the dangers of the tone being too moralistic, but the dangers of the tone being too cozy, or the relationship being too cozy with autocratic leaders, or frankly, what is now all the more in vogue, strongmen, individual leaders. President Trump, and this will be a value-neutral statement, has expressed an affinity for some strongmen and clearly is pursuing a policy that may not be only realist but kind of hyper-realist. And I want to ask the realists in the room whether maybe there's some dangers of going a little too far in a relationship. My views that I'll express here briefly and hopefully more in the discussion are similar to views in an article that I published in the National Interest on our relationship with Saudi Arabia, and that Dan Byman, my colleague at Georgetown University, followed up with a bit. Like my colleague Paul, talk about some things at the level of general principles and then move to a few examples. I say there are 5 things to keep in mind. Clearly, there is the human rights case, the idealistic case for urging autocratic governments and autocratic leaders to reform. And I'm just going to stipulate I'm for those, but this discussion isn't about that. There are, I would say, 3 or 4 interest-based arguments to focus on in particular as reasons that you might not want to have unvarnished support for autocratic leaders or to cooperate too cozily. First, I would call the pressure cooker argument. This is not sort of stepping back from pushing the current leadership of an autocratic nation to recognize that it may be creating enemies, it may be creating extremists. A classic example, I would say, is General el-Sisi in Egypt, who is distinctively worse and tougher and more cruel as an autocratic leader than Mubarak ever was. And there are metrics for this. I mean, if you just like to, count the number of journalists who are locked up, it's not in their interest to have such a white-knuckled grip. Another argument on the interest-based case is, are they as valuable as we think they are? Paul, you're absolutely right. We have to work with other powers on practical problems. We've got to work with Turkey on the problem of all the refugees flowing out of the Middle East and North Africa. We have to work with China on the North Korea problem. But sometimes we fool ourselves about how useful these autocratic interlocutors might be. How useful will Russia really be in solving problems in Syria? How useful, in fact, will China be on the North Korea problem? It will require a significant shift of its position of being the cushion for the North Korean regime for ages. The six-party talks has had this great fantasy in the U.S. minds of both administrations of both parties about how much China would help us solve the problem. The third and fourth most, I think, strong arguments for an interest-based case on being tougher or more forthright with autocratic leaders is U.S. credibility. U.S. credibility on the domestic level, if you think in time frame, we need to bear in mind those opposition leaders, those civil society figures who will be watching the United States. Paul invoked hypocrisy. I think those domestically in autocratic governments who notice the United States not standing up for the values that it has espoused for decades will feel that they don't even have the backing of the United States if it doesn't position itself in favor of its principle. And I think that, fourth, the credibility of the United States internationally depends upon not throwing over the basic values that we believe in universally. Sure, we may not have the leverage to change a government's behavior, much less unseat a government, but for the United States to be clearly and publicly on the side of those who are being thrown into prison for being dissenters or those being subject to cruel religious persecution is important. U.S. power depends on more than military might and economic capacity. So I would just posit that there's a blend to be understood, that interest, a sophisticated view of interest, and in fact this was the focus of some of the articles in the earlier years of the national interest, of a kind of form of interpretation of the national interest that principles were part of the picture. They were important. I'll give you a few quick examples. I think with Russia, it's important to ask the question of how far cooperation will actually yield useful results that serve the U.S. interests. In China, it is interesting. We have the most centralized leadership in one person since Deng Xiaoping, and China has been moving backwards on civil liberties, even from one or two leaders ago. Should the United States not speak to those issues? With allies like al-Sisi in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, even if it's taking baby steps in the direction of reform, Erdogan, a NATO ally who is more and more squeezing out dissent on the internet and acting in a way that's illiberal, and Duterte in the Philippines. A classic example, are we winning something? He doesn't, he's getting an open hand for dialogue from the current president, and he's still slapping it. By the way, the Philippines does offer an example of the United States pivoting at the right moment. Those examples of South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines of a long-term game to bring about change, it actually was a Reagan administration interpretation of interests as including values as an integral part that led to a shift in the latter part of the Reagan administration to really push South Korea, the Philippines, and even Marcos there in the right direction. The last example I'd note would probably be the one that might be the hardest case, but I talked about great powers, Russia and China, and about allies, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Philippines. There's one that's both, India. And I buy in fully to the idea that the United States should work closely with India on geopolitical things. But we shouldn't have a blind eye to the nationalism of Modi and the nature of his view of minorities, of minority religions, civil liberties, because it may in fact come to bite us in the rear. Thank you.
Let me ask you the same question, maybe a little bit differently. You have given different examples, but through your remarks, but what would you cite as really the most compelling example where our collaboration has definitively compromised very blatantly our values?
Well, I would use the example that I wrote about in the national interest, Saudi Arabia. I think that the United States so closely aligning with a really retrograde government has an interesting problem. We have not fully addressed the degree to which Saudi elites have subsidized extremism around the world, Wahhabism around the world. And I think that we haven't won ourselves as much as that cozy relationship is purported to deliver.
All right, let's go to the question of how do we deal with this issue? I mean, you referenced some considerations, but I know most policymakers will say that you can address and pursue a realistic policy, but one that is also grounded in idealism, support for our values, that you should be able to try to do both. It isn't either or. So, Paul, going to you first, and the question for both of you, how do you do it? What would you lay out? What kind of parameters, what type of metric? You had certain considerations here, but maybe elaborate a bit further.
Sure. No, I tried to speak to that a little bit at the end of my comments, and I certainly fundamentally agree with Mark in the sense that it's a mix of considerations, and I certainly wouldn't be the person to stand up and call for a foreign policy that's based on interests alone, precisely because it wouldn't be a practical policy, because the American people wouldn't stand for it, among other things. At the same time, there are clearly some cases that are kind of more obvious, and there are other cases that are much more challenging. The United States during World War II was helping the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union was, like us, fighting against Nazi Germany. That was a strategic calculation that we made at that time. If you come forward, and this is another Moscow-related one, the Clinton administration, as Dimitri Symes has written, turned down an offer from Vladimir Putin in 1999 to cooperate against the Taliban. That was in no small part a values-based calculation, and it led, led is perhaps too strong, but history after that took kind of an unwelcome direction for us as far as Afghanistan was concerned. I think that gets in some ways really to what I see as one of the toughest cases, which is the question of working with authoritarian governments on the issue of terrorism, because on one hand, it is something that's highly desirable to the United States. Terrorism is a real and growing threat. Certainly if we watch the news from Europe, it seems to be just becoming worse and worse every week, and that's certainly something that no one in the United States would ever want. But if we cooperate with authoritarian governments in that area, we typically have to work closely with actually the most authoritarian part of those governments, with the security services, the intelligence agencies, et cetera, which gives certainly many people pause. At the same time, when our rhetoric in dealing with a government like that is focused in a way that causes people in that government to think that we want to change the nature of their government, those very people who we want most to cooperate with are the ones who are going to be most threatened by what we're saying. And that's why I think that's one of the most challenging dilemmas, perhaps that we face.
Let me still push you. I didn't still hear you say, how will we do it? I'm hearing certain things
Sure.
from you that you're saying that all cases are not the same,
Mm-hmm,
okay?
mm-hmm.
It's different circumstances. different elements that get weighed in. I'm also, hearing you say that, at least I extracting,
Yeah.
that you're also giving examples where some of our own interests have prevailed more and maybe impacting the situation. So just generically, I mean, not giving examples,
Well,
what would be a few concepts that you think are important to keep in mind?
Conceptually, I think it's all about finding the right balance. Mark mentioned President Reagan, who I think has a lot to offer in that area. I would point back actually to the Evil Empire speech, the famous Evil Empire speech. And, I'm not a particular fan of the Evil Empire, but if there ever were an evil empire, I think certainly the Soviet Union would be close to the top of the list. At the same time, though, if you go back and read that speech, there were, I think, 2 or 3 paragraphs before the paragraph about how the Soviet Union was an evil empire. Reagan talked about the many challenges in our own historical legacy in the United States, and how we had worked to overcome a number of those challenges, but still faced many of them. And I think that a little bit greater humility, like what Reagan expressed about our own experience, can go a long way.
All right, Mark.
Paul and I agree on a lot of things as reasonable people. I agree with one thing that he just alluded to. I think it's important in U.S. exercising its power in the world to be an exemplar. It needs to look itself in the mirror and it needs to admit that when it lectures other countries about their fighting human trafficking, it ought to be strong in its efforts. It ought to worry about civil liberties in its own country when it lectures others. A few things. Generally, don't cut off dialogue with autocrats. That's as a last resort, cutting off all dialogue. As a last resort, that even pales, but by the way one ought to modulate it. Don't seek regime change through use of force or through covert means as a general principle, but you may need to have it as a last resort. Third, or fourth, you need to raise human rights publicly. A lot of people talk about quiet, behind-the-scenes dialogue. Yes, you need to have that to get the release of political prisoners by the Chinese and so on. But the record indicates that also raising issues publicly puts pressure on other governments. We talk about having China save face. Sometimes you need to have a little bit of stinging of the face. Talk to civil society. I wrote another article for the National Interest about diplomacy that engages civil society. We need to do that. You're right, Paul. We need to keep our eyes open about unsavory characters in opposition movements, that they may not share our values. But there is better and there's worse. And that's actually the story of Syria. If we'd worked earlier to assist the better rather than the worst, perhaps ISIS might not have metastasized quite as much as it did to be the dominant player in the area.
Yeah, I have another question for both of you, and then we're going to go to all of you, and I'll give also Dimitri rights of maybe posing a question or comment first. But one other. I noticed in your remarks, and you also worked with Jean Kirkpatrick, that you did indicate that you believe that authoritarian regimes can evolve, change. She gave the thesis, of course, of authoritarianism versus totalitarianism, that you should work with authoritarian regimes because of the prospect of bringing about change. In your remarks, I think you excluded that. I don't think, all right, well, you can comment. I kind of came away with the impression that no, and I think one of your earlier points, that we have limited leverage. Mark, address that first. How does that issue and where you stand on that of what you think your policies could do if they can bring about change? How does that impact
we should
us?
want authoritarian regimes to evolve so that they don't have a pressure cooker and to make it a more pacific world, small p. I think that authoritarian regimes can evolve, but there does need to be a push. It doesn't have to be melodramatic, it doesn't have to be shrill, and it should have some sense of time frame, but there does need to be a push. I commend to you an article that was written by Robert Kagan at one time, in commentary, Dictatorships and Double Standards Revisited, in which he noted this late Reagan-era policy on countries like Chile under Pinochet, South Korea, Taiwan, Philippines, that it was in fact the push that helped the evolution.
Okay. And Paul.
Well, I didn't mean to give the impression that I'm opposed to engaging those regimes on that issue. I think my point about our limited leverage had more to do with the results that we should expect and how we should go about doing that. I think that ultimately a government has to want to change itself because it sees it in its own interest to change. We can try to make our case for why we think that is. I tend to think it'll be more effective if it's a case based on pragmatic grounds that takes into account the interests of the leaders and elites in those systems, because it's not easy to persuade people to step down from power or to put their futures at risk. That's one of the hardest things to ask people to do in a situation like that. But I certainly think it's possible. Again, it's about their calculation of their interests, and to the extent that we can do a better job in understanding how they assess their own interests, then we can be more effective in delivering those kinds of messages.
Okay. As I mentioned, Dimitri, would you like to say or add something at the time? All right, let's go to all of you because I do want to get your involvement. I'll go to the end of the table and then work forward. We'll get both of you. Yes, Jacob. All right, we'll go ladies first. All right.
Sorry.
Go ahead and
Thank-
introduce yourself to everyone,
Sure.
please.
Thank you very much. Was wonderful discussion. My name is Nazira Azim Karimi. I'm correspondent for Ariana Television from Afghanistan. Basically, I'm from Afghanistan too, and I'm so glad and happy that after a long time I met Ms. Dobriansky. Afghan people has a wonderful memories from you. You did a lot for Afghan people, especially Afghan women. Any commitment for Afghanistan since the regime change? What do you think about Afghan people, especially Afghan women? And what do you think about Donald Trump's policy, new policy toward Afghanistan? Because every day Afghan people is been killed and a terrible situation. Thank
Okay,
you very much.
Thank you for the question. And if you pass the mic to Jacob, who's at the end.
I already have.
Oh, you got one, great, okay. Okay, there you go. All right. Mark.
Well, I just think that, some people feel that the United States has invested a lot of time and money, blood, sweat, and tears in Afghanistan, and I think we need to remember that not just stability and not just cleansing a corruption problem are at stake, but there are some things that moved remarkably forward, particularly for the lot of women, with the initial use of force led by the United States. And that's just something we shouldn't completely give up on, and in fact we should tilt our preferences in our policy towards the voice of women and the voice of civil society.
Okay, do you want to add anything
No,
to that? No?
I don't think so.
Okay, Jacob. And everybody knows you, but in the spirit of
I don't know that-
introductions.
I'm Jacob Heilbrunn
Okay,
from the
thanks.
National Interest Magazine. And I have separate questions for Mark and Paul. First question for Paul would be, how close should we get to an authoritarian regime? It seems to me one of the case examples that would counter your argument would be Iran after 1953, when we have enormous blowback from the decisions that we made in embracing the Shah of Iran. For Mark, my question is the reverse. It is, you have Donald Trump embracing some dictators and then at the same time denouncing Cuba on human rights grounds. Doesn't this raise the specter that the ideals you talk about and the concept of human rights are simply, in the eyes of much of the world, an ideological smokescreen for the United States to advance its own interests as it defines them? If you're Vladimir Putin or sitting in Beijing, you hear this talk about human rights and see it as sheer hypocrisy, given, you know, we can go through the recent history of the United States, black prison, you know, the prisons in Poland under the George W. Bush administration, Iraq War, ad nauseum. So how do we get around that?
Okay, thank you. Let's go to you first.
Well,
First question.
you know, on Iran, Jacob, I view that as kind of an interesting case because it illustrates a somewhat broader point, at least to my mind. It's, in that case, not a question of intervening actually to try to promote greater democracy, but actually facilitating a coup in Iran in 1953 that led to kind of a different political system, and then supporting that. And to my mind, what that illustrates is the extent to which we need to be careful getting involved in other people's politics in general. The fact that other people resent outside governments getting involved in their politics is not one that should require any particular explanation in Washington right now, to my mind.
Okay, and your question.
I welcome your question, and I was struck by an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal by Judy Shelton of the Hoover Institution, who serves as the chair of the board of the National Endowment for Democracy. In her recent op-ed, she said that policies of using force related to gas weapons in Syria and the position of the Trump administration on Venezuela and Cuba proved that, in fact, it is President Trump and the administration are not allergic to democracy promotion. I think they are striking outliers, and they could well raise the question of hypocrisy. If you haven't figured it out yet, my position is the way you fix the double standards problem is to make sure that the United States is clearly on the side of liberalization of autocratic regimes. There will always be a situation where the United States is seen as cooperating with a partner that is autocratic and called hypocritical. But I think that it's not a viable position to not speak to human rights issues and eliminate the double standards problem by not having a values-free foreign policy.
Can I respond directly just on that latter point? I'm not arguing for a values-free foreign policy, of course. I think what I'm arguing for is not allowing our rhetoric to get so far in front of our capabilities to affect change that we look hypocritical or impotent or whatever else one could call it in the situation.
This isn't an answer to your question, but in Saudi Arabia, the president in his remarks used the term principled realism as a concept that was introduced in his remarks. We have Ruth Wedgwood over here. We have a mic. I don't know. It's right here. She's up front. Oh, okay. Well,
you gave me the perfect
okay.
segue.
Okay. He has the mic. She's right here. Hi. Okay.
We have
Sorry.
one on this side.
But
Okay,
Paula,
got it.
I did not do this as a stand-up arrangement, but Paula gave me the perfect segue, which is that I guess I get weary with sort of chiliastic arguments about democracy, not democracy, realism, idealism, when to me the basic continuing Achilles heel in our foreign policy is we are so bloody ignorant, willfully ignorant of the countries we're dealing with. So again, the idea of transferring Foreign Service personnel every 2 years, lest they become corrupted by the locals whom they come to know. Exactly the people you want to be in bed with if you want to anticipate events and affect events. That attempt at virginity is so counterproductive. And I asked Hayden when he was at SICE about it. He said, well, I don't know, they do it. But it's not what the Brits did. It's not what Joseph Conrad did. It's not what Africanists did in the old days. You got read into your society. So you could play it in a continental setting, in a more international setting. And that, I think, is something that, for whatever reason, we haven't really challenged. We're concerned about corruption, and families want to get back with their loved ones. But you really need people in place for 5 years, 10 years.
Actually, when Jacob
Please.
pushed me to improve the draft of my article on societal diplomacy to engage civil society, one thing I thought of was this problem of rotation of diplomats. If you really want to understand societies and you want to engage people not just in the government, but they're in society too, you need to know the society, and you need to have personnel in place for a longer period of time. Rather than
So
rotate.
who here is from the State Department that will change this ridiculous policy?
We see, we see
I'm
we see
looking at
someone.
two. I'm looking at two.
That's
of
right,
them.
there are two people here who, they heard you, Okay, let's go over here, right, yep. And I'm gonna let each of you introduce yourselves instead of spouting out everybody's. Please,
Sure.
we know.
Thanks, Paula.
Thank
Tamara
you.
Wittes from Brookings. So I want to go back just for a minute to the idea of interest-based arguments for engaging carefully with autocratic partners. And Paul, I think this is really directed more at you, although I'd welcome a response from each of you, which is that it seems to me useful in evaluating the question of how useful are autocrats as partners. It seems to me wise to contrast American relationships with autocrats with the relationships we have with democratic allies. And, you know, we always say rhetorically, of course, the United States' closest partners are democratic. Why is that? What is it about working with democracies that make them better partners for us? And perhaps if we probe that, we can get a better handle on the vulnerabilities of working with autocrats. So the ability to see inside the politics of our partner country, to understand it, and not just to have transparency into it, but to understand how it works and how we might work with that leader to shape their domestic politics so that they can support our cooperation, right? That's what gives us faith in their commitments. It makes us believe that they are more reliable. And so I guess the question for you, Paul, is if you believe that we shouldn't meddle, okay, and of course it's hard for us to understand these other countries. Their politics aren't transparent because they're not democratic. How can we hope to have reliable, cooperative relationships with these kinds of governments?
Well, I think I would have several responses to that. The first thing I would say is that precisely because they share our values, democracies actually tend to change their policies rather frequently. And I think we've often found that some of our close democratic allies change their minds on things that are important to us. And
remain very close.
no, of course. And I would go back actually to the first point that I made in considerations in dealing with these governments, where I think I said actually explicitly that we need to be honest with ourselves and with our partners, that there's only so much that the American people and the Congress will support in our relations with these governments. And I said explicitly, actually, that we need to communicate that to these partners so that they understand that if there's more that they want from the United States, that may require changes in their conduct in order to satisfy America's domestic political requirements. I think that's a pretty clear interest-based argument for that kind of effort. But the way that you do that is by going to a government and saying, look, you know, we understand that you want X, Y, and Z. Unfortunately, we're not in a position really to do that, and there's considerable domestic opposition in the United States to doing that because of A, B, and C in your country. And, you know, what do you think you may be able to do to address that? To my mind, that's how you deal effectively with a problem like that. You know, I guess I also have, oh shoot, I had one other point, but it
But you're
left
having a
me.
senior
But
moment.
I'll come back to it if I remember it later. I'm sorry.
Okay, you're having a senior moment.
Yes, I am.
I don't, did you want to comment on this? Because I wanted to ask, if you don't mind giving the mic back, and then we're going to pass it to you, but give it back to Tamara. What's your own answer to your question? Because you were a Deputy Assistant Secretary and dealing with Middle Eastern countries, and, you know, and this goes to the heart of a number of things we're discussing. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I actually have real doubts about the reliability of autocratic partners. And I'm actually working on a book right now on America's relations with autocratic allies, because I think it is a longstanding dilemma in U.S. foreign policy that we've never figured out. And it may be because there's no good answer. But my own experience, I actually think the Gulf crisis that we're seeing right now is a perfect example of how we think we have a meeting of the minds on what's our top shared priority. We think we've built this wonderful coalition. But these guys have other things on their minds that they're not necessarily going to share with us, and we don't have a lot of visibility into. And right now, we're getting wrapped around the axle in our own attempt to rally the forces in the region to defeat ISIS because of their internecine squabbles that have a lot more to do with regime security than with any interests of the United States.
Okay, thank you for that. And Paul
And
remembered what he was going to say.
yeah, I remembered my other point, and this is a response a little bit also to Mark, who raised also the question of how much can we really get from these governments. You know, I think there are two ways of looking at that question, and to my mind, they're equally important. One is, what can we get beyond what we already have, or you know, what new cooperation can we get from a Russia or from a Saudi Arabia? You know, that's a legitimate question to ask. Certainly in the case of Russia right now, I think it looks pretty bleak, actually. But there's a second question, which is, what can we avoid if we remain actively engaged with these governments? And Russia, I think, is another good example there. If that relationship goes really bad, I think there are a lot of things that people aren't really thinking about now that could start to happen. I mean, it certainly, if you look back at the Cold War experience and some aspects of Soviet behavior during that time period, there's a lot of bad stuff that isn't happening today that could happen, you know, tomorrow or next week or 6 months from now, if that relationship really falls apart.
Okay, we had a question right here, just right there. Thank you. And if you'll.
Olga Oliker from CSIS. I'm struck by the difficulty of untangling the question of dealing with dictators from the question of promoting democracy. And since we are talking in part about promoting democracy, I'm going to ask what might be a slightly provocative question, which is, what do both of you think is the role of practicing what you preach here? And the extent to which democracy promotion begins at home if you really want to avoid hypocrisy, and whether you think we are facing any particular challenges in that regard going forward.
I'm happy to take that up. And I alluded to this earlier, that I really think it's a false dichotomy to say should the United States be an exemplar or a promoter of its values. In order to be an effective active promoter of universal values, whatever you want to call them, fundamental freedoms, if not the D word, you do need to worry about being an exemplar. So, you know, when the United States had developed a policy of enhanced interrogation, or if there is sort of questioning of the value of an independent judiciary or of the free press, those have a bearing on its ability to effectively stand up for those values. Look, these aren't binary things. You know, it isn't democracy or not in a country, or transparent or not. But the United States should tilt in the direction of more transparency, more human rights, more openness, and that requires those things at home. I know many people in the room probably disagree with me, but I do think there are implications of the level of surveillance that the United States pursues in terms of that imagery of living, you know, practicing what we preach.
Paul, do you want to comment?
Yeah. I guess I would say two things. One is I tilt somewhat more than Mark in the direction of leading by example, although again it's a continuum and not either or. You know, the second thing that I would say about that is, shoot, actually I'm doing it again, I'm sorry. I forgot again. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay,
It's
he's
a
having
tough
another
day
C1
for me.
level.
My
You
mind
could
is
just
on a lot
Jump
of
in
other
with another
things.
example,
Yeah,
and I may give
sure,
you a
definitely.
lifeline for
Yeah.
calling a good
I'm
idea.
having a tough
What's no
day.
doubt a good
I'm
idea.
having a tough day.
After I was ambassador at large to combat human trafficking, reporting to Paula, I decided my next step going out of government was to go lead a U.S.-focused nonprofit on human trafficking. My view was I'd spent 2 years hectoring other countries to improve their human rights record with respect to human trafficking, and that we were most effective when, you know, during that period we were raising how the United States was trying to fight the problem, and that, you know, that there were things we weren't managing to do. We weren't managing to, you know, deal with child sex trafficking very well in the United States, and so I think it's important for the United States to be an exemplar.
I'll come back later.
Well, no,
on
we're
that
very
one.
lucky that
Yeah.
you came in, so don't worry about it. Yes, you have them. Oh, you got the mic.
Thank you. I'm Eric Sharayev. I represent George Mason together with Professor Duick. He's here. He was here, and also head of a lab of character assassination, reputation, and politics. When I connect the old culture, mature culture of ours, and the young culture, and I appeal to those who are younger than 40 in this audience. So back in 1970, bleep, I'll just here to say when, I young students at Soviet Union high school, my teachers, brave enough, organized discussion about whether or not the Soviet Union had to cooperate with the United States. And it was smart enough and brave enough to say not with the evil empire, US, but it was definitely evil empire, but with an imperialist country such as US. And remember, the conclusion was, and our brave history teacher told us, that there are communist interests and values, and we have to help our pragmatic interests help our values, and our values to help our pragmatic interests. I was puzzled and flabbergasted and pleased with this wonderful answer. Yes, we have to combine two things. Now, many, many moons later, as a U.S. citizen, I just talked to my friends at Silicon Valley, frankly, just friends of my children, so they are there. And there's those gee whiz, just as tech whiz and they're geniuses in software who told me, yes, it is possible in a contemporary world to create a software that would combine your values, whatever they are, define them, and your pragmatic interests, whatever they are, define them. As a recovering constructivist, well, I can say we can define them. We can define them. And they told me, just piece of paper, napkin, Eric, it's about $10 million initial capital. We'll create software within a year. I said to them, yes, I have 10,000. Just give me a long stare. Well, but maybe those of you who are younger than 40, and most of us are, I guess, right? Maybe that's at the time for us to create this software that will put aside our arguments about the combining values and interests, and just we have simple answers. Like, I apply for a loan, I am a number for loan companies, and just treat me with a number. I apply for anything these days, and they look at me, I'm a number for them, and just find the best answer for me. Maybe just for our foreign policy, it's time for us to look at the younger people who are able to create those softwares and tell us which policy is most ideal for us, combining those values and our pragmatic interests.
I'm looking at the science advisor to the Secretary of State over there. I think this is squarely within your wheelhouse.
I was going to say, neither
This is
of
an
you will
art.
comment about Watson and IBM. I mean, Watson is really out there, so if you're putting that on the table. All right, let me ask one, and while some of you are thinking a little bit more, what bearing does this question have in terms of the role of the United States? You know, there's a real heated debate and a discussion about how engaged we are or should be. And I could think, obviously, in recent time, our different administrations have had different approaches to this. So on this very question, what bearing does your position have on that question of our involvement and maybe unintended consequences by either strong leadership or a lack of leadership? Paul?
Well, I think that one of the reasons that the United States has been able successfully to be a leader in the international system is that we have a capability to stand for something bigger than ourselves. And if you look at our principal rivals, they are, at least so far, much less successful at doing that in a way that attracts others to support them, except in the most kind of narrow and particular ways. So I would never say that values aren't an important component of U.S. leadership. The question really is much more about how. It certainly gets back to the issue we were just talking about of the role of example in our conduct. I think it also there's a separate question of policies that work, which to my mind connects back to what I was trying to say about allowing our rhetoric to get too far in front of our capability in a way that undercuts our credibility, which in turn undermines our leadership. And there are other considerations too, but perhaps I'll stop there and let Mark.
Well, and just, leadership is related to selectivity of how, where you engage. And I think we should be careful not to make the mistake of thinking that, it is necessarily a stronger or a husbanding resources policy to be engaged in fewer places. I think that, in particular, while we should be selective where we use force to advance human rights and values, very selective, and while we should be selective about where we press diplomatically the most for change politically, U.S. leadership in the world depends upon U.S. stature. And our identity is wrapped up in values. We can try and be the amoral power of cosmopolitan Europe or Europe, but in the end, despite this moment that we seem to be in now politically, it's not our DNA, and I don't think we'll succeed at global leadership that way.
Perhaps I could add one final thought on this point. It's, and this may be a bit of a reach, but I think it's useful to think about. It's interesting to me that when we think about political systems inside other countries, we want to have these kind of rigid authoritarian governments adopt approaches that are more flexible, that are more open to minorities, that work toward reconciling all kinds of different opinions and points of view. And when we go up one level, and when we look at the international system level, we're all about enforcing the rules, right? And to me, some of the points that Mark was making about the pressure cooker when you try to enforce the rules in that way deserve some consideration at the next level up in the system. And I think that's the kind of question that if we want to stay a leader, I think we're going to have to think pretty hard on that one.
Okay, I saw 3 hands, and we're going to take all 3. Henri, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Christian, and then we'll go to you over here. And even though everyone knows you, introduce yourself.
Henri Barker at the Wilson Center. It seems to me we started by saying that the United States, being a global power, has to deal with every single country in the world. I mean, by the very nature of the global power. But I think if you flip that around, you would also realize that every other country in the world has to deal with the United States. So very often we underestimate the importance or the importance that the United States, the important role the United States plays in the domestic politics and in the foreign policy of other countries, and we don't harness that. And yes, it is true that the Chinese and the Russians are not about to change their policies or the nature of the regime because we have the higher values or the pragmatic values. But the truth is, for every other country, other than, let's say, our real allies, let's say, the democratic, genuinely democratic societies, they all fall in this continuum in between. And how we deal with them is important in the following sense. We don't necessarily, it will be impossible to make Saudi Arabia democratic. But we can expect certain modes of behavior from all of these countries. A whole bunch of leaders like to come to Washington and have a photo op with the president, even whomever the president is, and they all want something from the United States. Why don't we essentially make it a policy that, A, we don't have to be nice to these countries that are not democratic. We don't have to invite them to the White House. We don't have to keep saying, oh, what a wonderful relationship we have, as you clobber and imprison a whole bunch of people. But we can also say, you want certain things from the United States. In exchange for this, we want you to release 5, 10, 15, whomever, prisoners, journalists, or whatever. In other words, make it a little bit transactional. I mean, with the understanding that we have to think of the long term. We have to hope that in the long term we will be able to change and influence other countries to change their values. But in the short term, we do have a great deal of influence. I mean, they want access to our markets. They want our help in whatever dispute they have. Why don't we use that leeway, leverage, I should say, that we have? And I think very often Americans, especially if you live in Washington, we fail to see how the rest of the world perceive us. Sometimes not positively, obviously, but we are a very important presence in their life every day. They wake up in the morning and essentially try to figure out what is it that the United States is doing and wants to do, and then accordingly arrange their policies.
Okay, thank you for that question, and pass it to the Christian next to you. Okay, but Mark and then Paul, both of you need to answer this one.
Well,
and respond.
Henri, I'm delighted you asked this because I think one of Paul's premises is that we don't have as much leverage with some of these autocratic governments as we think we do, and that we can't change them just by willfully asking them to. But the United States does have leverage, and whether it's a giant power and growing power like China, it's worth asking, how much do they need us in addition to us needing them for North Korea or as our banker? How much do they need us? And I do think it's worth asking, look at the people who have come to the Oval Office. in this young presidential administration and see, are we spending our chips too easily? You invite El-Sisi to the Oval Office and you say he's doing a fantastic job. Are you doing exactly the opposite of the formula that Henri is suggesting?
I'm going to say actually 4 things, but I'm going to try to do it really fast. And this time I wrote them down. So first thing is, how much leverage do we have? It depends. It depends on what we want from them. It depends on what they want from us. It's just going to be different in every case. And I think you have to look at every case different, on its own merit. Secondly, if you take a transactional approach, and I'm not opposed to a transactional approach, and actually what I said sort of suggested a transactional approach, I think, when I was talking about explaining how our own domestic politics works to others. At the same time, if you decide that you're going to have a transaction, then there's going to be a debate inside our government and in our policy community about what it is that we most should want for our end of the transaction. And in some cases it may be that, but in other cases it's probably going to be other things. And my guess is actually that debate happens a lot of the time already now, and that sometimes we choose that, and a lot of the time we choose other things. The third thing I would say is, when I talk about working with these governments, I'm not talking about embracing them. I'm not talking about praising them. I'm not talking about offering them special favors. I'm talking about having a working government-to-government relationship that allows us to do the things that we need to do. The final point that I would make, which is kind of overarching, is, democracy. Why is it that we're trying to promote democracy? Which, I think is a useful thing to try to do. But it's not, at least to my mind, so that people can vote or something like that. It's because we think that it will help citizens in other countries to have better lives in ways that they value. I think we also need to think in these cases, is what we're trying to do in a particular situation going to work toward that goal, which is helping people in other countries to live better lives in the way that they want to live them. Democracy is a means, at least from my point of view. It's not an end. And actually, I wrote this recently in a piece. If you read the preamble to the Constitution, we the people in order to blah, 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 blah. It's kind of very clear that the founders were setting out the Constitution actually as a means to these other ends that they wanted to accomplish. And I view that as an important element that we shouldn't forget.
Christian, before you ask your question, you had
I just wanted to say that
comment.
an implication here is if you think you don't have leverage, it may become a self-fulfilling prophecy. I will argue bitterly and constructively with someone who doesn't think the United States should promote democracy or pluralism in other countries. But that's a different thing from saying they might be a worthwhile goal, but we don't have the leverage. I think there is perhaps a self-fulfilling prophecy if we don't understand some of the dynamics Henri raises.
Did you want to comment on this point? After, okay, well, we have Christian and we have one other gentleman back there.
Right.
So, okay, all right.
Thank
Go
you,
ahead,
Paula. Yeah,
Christian.
Christian Whiten, State Department. Question for Mark. With Syria, we all know the horror story, more than 300,000 dead, humanitarian crisis, an exodus that has led to violent jihad in Europe, now an ISIS insurgency in Philippines that may have links back. So clearly a situation where it's in our interest to bring an end to the hostilities as quickly as possible. Can you articulate any scenario where you would get an end to the Syrian civil war without having some sort of arrangement with both Putin and Assad, neither of whom are exactly Boy Scouts.
And also, before Mark responds to that, we're going to get your question, and then Dmitry will have the last question, and then we'll be closing. So just people know time. Well, no. Where he's going to answer to this, and then we'll go to yours, and Dmitry, and then we're going to close the roundtable. Go ahead.
So, I feel for those who are in power now because, you inherit a Syria situation which is much worse even than it was a few years ago. I just question whether the United States can expect a durable peace in the region if it rewards Assad for what he's done. He's not a garden variety autocrat in the way he has subjected his people to atrocities. And 2 administrations in a row have suggested it's a special thing to use gas warfare when thousands upon thousands of people have been killed with other weapons.
Yes, let's go to yours, and then we're going to have Dmitry get his last point, and he can make the last comments with them.
Okay, I'm Daniel McCarthy, the editor-at-large of the American Conservative magazine, and I wanted to ask the panelists about the problem of illiberal democracy. Are there circumstances on the horizon in which the key to making another state more liberal may in fact require making it less democratic? We can look at the trajectory of places like Turkey and perhaps Hungary as well, where popular sentiment seems to be running against the values that America prefers. And certainly some of our rivals in the world point to American democracy promotion as in fact being rather contrary to the cultural values of the people, not just the rulers, but the people of certain other states. So I wanted to pose the problem of illiberal democracy.
I'm going to go to you again, because just what you had said before.
There's so much to say on that, and it's rich, and it's worth looking at things that Fareed Zakaria has been writing 20 years after having focused on that term. I just actually note that pluralism and minority rights are deeply important. To the degree that U.S. interests are caught up in the internal governance of countries, where minority peoples, ethnic groups, races, and religious groups are silenced, and there is the more brutal forms of majority rule, it becomes problematic, and it actually has a bearing on stability in the world as well.
You wanted to comment on that question.
Yeah, I guess this will just be very brief, but I think for me, illiberal democracy depends a lot on how you got there. And what I mean by that is there's one direction of getting to illiberal democracy, which comes from being an illiberal authoritarian society, in which case actually that's kind of a good problem to have in the sense that, it's going in the right direction, exactly. And then it's something else, obviously, if you're talking about Turkey, which has come up many times today. Ultimately, though, to me, it's perhaps in a perverse way a reflection of the fact that we don't really have the same kind of war of ideas that we had in the past. And these illiberal leaders actually want the forms of democracy, just not the content.
Dmitry?
My question is to both of you, but primarily to Mark. Actually, Paula, I would be also very interested in your opinion. This is a question of leverage and what works. We obviously have leverage even over countries like the Soviet Union, and I'm mentioning the Soviet Union intentionally because I am thinking about the Jewish immigration. And I am a beneficiary of that immigration many, many years ago. And if there was no Jackson-Vanik Amendment, I'm not sure I would be in this distinguished company. But the reason the Jackson-Vanik Amendment worked was first, the objective was limited. Let Jews and some others primarily dissidents, also Germans, let them go. It did not undermine the fundamentals of the regime. And second, the Nixon-Kissinger administration and then the Ford administration offered the Soviet Union a reasonable hope of a better relationship and credits. So the Soviets did not open the gates, but they opened the door. And they allowed a fairly limited immigration, but 32,000 in 1972, 73 in 1974. It was all closed when the relationship went down the hill. Then they allowed 51,000 when Jimmy Carter signed the SALT agreement. And then when the agreement was rejected, the numbers went to something like 1,000. But clearly, our leverage is sufficient to force even a country like the Soviet Union, under right circumstances, make some concessions. Real facts. Then there is another example. In 2011, the Clinton administration, I should say, the Obama-Clinton administration, they essentially supported a major political change in Russia. Because what we wanted the Russians to do, it was not small potato. We demanding that they would allow free and open elections. And we were communicating that as a first step, Mr. Putin should not come back as president. You may remember Vice President Biden even suggested that publicly. Mass demonstrations in Moscow were supported by Hillary Clinton, openly, publicly. Let's face it, if Putin agreed to do what he was pressured to do, he would be out of power. And because of pervasive corruption in Russia, he probably would be in jail. Or in exile, I don't know who would take him. Under those circumstances, what we were asking Putin to do would be what a defeated power normally would agree to do. We succeeded with Milosevic in Serbia, but Russia was a somewhat different story. And what the Russians have done? They decided to interfere in our election. And I do not know for sure what exactly was the level of their involvement and how meaningful was the involvement. I think it's very clear that they tried to do something in response. And we took very, very seriously, and in terms of our Congress, very, very personally. My question is, if we are moving with democracy promotion against other major powers who have responses of their own, should we operate on the basis of principle because our cause is just and accordingly we will eventually prevail? Or should we ask a question which we normally ask when we think about any kind of foreign policy and particularly any kind of warfare? Where are we going to be when these bastards are going to respond? And if not, why not?
Great question. And I will say that I entirely agree with a premise that Paul has repeated, which is a test for a policy should be results. So it shouldn't just feel good. It shouldn't just be in favor of our values. You should know what the goal is and advance it. You raised two interesting points. Should U.S. policy or instruments of policy be as targeted as possible, like Jackson-Vanik, it related to a discrete issue, and should the United States not put itself at the center of the story, which in essence, by Hillary Clinton, embracing a movement did. Generally speaking, I think it's a good idea to have targeted policy. That's one reason why I think the sanctions that are best are those that are targeted on particular leaders responsible for heinous human rights abuses or corruption, as opposed to blanket ones that harm the people. But there are broader policies that matter. When Henry Kissinger got around to writing the third volume of his memoirs, he kind of rethought the Helsinki Accords and felt that they actually had a positive influence, and they were a much broader arrangement than the Jackson-Vanik approach. On the example from 2011 that you raised, what's interesting was there was hypocrisy there because in the case of Iran, the Obama administration did not want to make itself too much the center of the story by embracing the green movement in in Iran, and I think that was a mistake. I think the United States should not put itself too much at the center of something, but my wife likes to say, if you're going to do the time, you might as well do the crime. If the United States is going to be, called, overly involved in the internal affairs of other countries, the worst case scenario is for us to be thought that way and not have any active policy.
I think my short answer is two parts. First, I do think targeted approaches are and having results, I think, are the best and optimal, because in this area you are having tangible, concrete results. And actually, one could argue it can end up being a win-win. That's what it is for both sides. And where the way in which Jackson Vanik was constructed, and I remember in being in the White House at that time and dealing with a lot of well-known cases, even divided spouse cases that were existing at the time that go beyond also the whole Jackson Vanik period. Let me flip that and then also add that then it'll be interesting to see, let's take Cuba. Cuba's in the news these days. There were some very heated debates over the approach of the Obama administration on Cuba, because some argued that the very thing that you're saying should have been on the table, where it was targeted in terms of political prisoners. But they opted not to have any kind of conditionality in that relationship. And I remember reading, actually, people at the time take two sides. Some said that was the way to go, because then it will come eventually. Others said, no, it's not, because it didn't provide any structure or parameters, and time will tell. But I just put that out there because it's right in front and center now in policy discussions, and that whole debate over what was the best way to go. The third is on the broader declarations. I have to say, I think it really depends. They're of a different value and for a different purpose, because, the statements made so many times about what we, the United States, are about. We're an idea. And I think a number of you in different questions have said that. And because we are about an idea, we're looked up to. And when those principles are not espoused, then there is a vacuum. And I don't see anyone else stepping forward with those ideas. But the point that I was going to make, I could think of time and again, whether you talk about then the Soviet Union or Burma, I'll pick out now. I mean, I could go from country to country where there will be those who will say, we appreciate the broad words and principles of what you say. They matter to us. They're inspirational. We look to them. And by the way, I'll also say that at the same time, even if we might be hypocritical, which were questions before, nevertheless, I don't think there are those that look to us as always pursuing, because of a change of our own government, Republican, Democrat, and even from Republican to Republican or Democrat to Democrat. There isn't always an absolute consistency. But I do think that the core principles of what we're identified with, and something that I think both, I'll end on that note, both Paul and Mark, I think, agreed on, at least in my view, is the importance of the values that identify us. And that's crucial in maintaining that. That really matters in terms of what we are about and even the leverage that we have. So, just forgive me, just their expressions. Rather know between the two of them.
I thought the question was mainly for the two of them. I don't think I have anything more to add. I've said a lot.
Okay.
You can see that Paul is a real diplomat.
Thanks very much for coming. Let's give them a strong round of applause. Thank you both. Great job.
Very enjoyable.
Great job.
Thanks for